So I'm going to read a little bit from the book first, and actually one of my Rumpus columns, since I owe such a debt to the Rumpus for this book and for just my life and my identity as a man. And since Stephen and I are here to talk about all that, so thanks so much for coming, and I'm so happy to be at the Strand. This is like a dream come true. So this is the prologue. South Carolina, August 2010, 29 years old. What makes a man? It's not that I haven't studied them, their sinew, their slang, their beautiful bristle, but before I was held at gunpoint on a cold April day, I couldn't have told you. A real man, a family man, the Marlboro man up, the man in the mirror. I loved that Michael Jackson song growing up. Used to forget my girl hips, used to sing it to my best imagination of myself. What makes a man? The need to know led me to my father's hometown in hot, damp South Carolina. The story starts there because that's where I went when I could no longer afford to leave the question alone. To let it rear up every few years when I'd had too much to drink and it was just me and my reflection and my hungry ghosts. And so I steered my rental through the swampy South with my cap pulled low. I had that teen boy swagger, scars like smiles across my chest, and a body I was just beginning to love. But the story also begins the night I almost died, back in April of 2010. And in 1985, when my father became a monster, and in 1990, when my mom found out he was one. Men, she'd said then, and I'd learned to say it the same way, a lemon in my mouth. In South Carolina, I could smell it through my open window, alligators and secrets, the embers of Sherman's March, the Ku Klux Klan, my father's farm, burning. It smelled like my animal fear and the spicy deodorant I used to cover it. Men, I thought, with that old bitterness, but I already knew my body was shifting. In fact, that's why I was there. A good man is hard to find. The windshield blurred, the road was inky, the rain, biblical. The cheap motel off the highway seemed like not such a hot idea after I passed my fifth gun-wrapped pickup, but there wasn't any turning back. Once a body's in motion, it stays in motion. My mom's a physicist. She told me that. The truth is, this is a ghost story. Nope, this is an adventure story. This is an adventure story about how I quit being a ghost. Where I grew up in western Pennsylvania, deers were hunted to keep the population down. Still, we put out salt licks and watch whole families wander by. I found I could open the door and approach them as long as I moved slowly enough. They lock eyes with me, ears pricked, stuck, as if stopped by time. I'd get closer and closer, 5 yards, 4, 3. I reach a hand out greedily and like magic, their eyes would pop open a little, their bodies hunching into themselves. Then, always, they'd spring awake and bound away, big and graceful, alive. There was an invisible line, a wire I'd trip, and it was different each time. 4 yards, 2. Every body has a different threshold. We all know how to run eventually. Most people don't realize that. We never forget how to escape. That's the book, which hopefully you all have a copy of now. And this is the last Self-Made Man. I'm working on a new one, but this is from July. It's called Tenderness 2. This summer, 3 years into my life as a man, it finally fully feels like my body is flowering into the truth of it. It's scruffier, sweatier, more embodied. It's melted gum on the subway platform, hair curling against pomade's mushy muscle, sloshy late-night Pimm's cups on my dusky rooftop, the sweat of held hands and damp beds and watery iced coffee cups blurred into photos I scroll through to try to pinpoint exactly where everything changed. There's not been a tipping point, more a collection of knife's edge moments. I gather them and build them into this house with its shimmering morning summer sun blasting us awake after last night's baffling fight and the choice we made on waking to turn toward each other and kiss clear through to the other side of it. Tough and tender, she says, my beard scratching in her hands. I've never been a guy falling in love, but I've asked for years what makes a man, and here she is with my answer. I wake at dawn most days. I stay still and watch sunrise shadows move across my curtains and think, I paid for this life. Not just the $60 a month and the weekly oily ritual, the alcohol swabs and the gauze and the shot in the leg. I traded a body and a careful plan for a fire-escape view of the supermoon this city and all its jigsawed bodies, this soft animal beside me, 1 in 9 million. The math of our meeting impossible, and yet here we are. I traded hours on the rowing machine for this hard chest and the rough pillow it makes for this woman who's fallen for my cat, both of them belly up and exposed in the shifting light, all three of us shepherding each other through into this glorious morning. She runs hot, she says, and she's right. She's also like me, rough and honest. A few weeks ago, I was on the phone with her in Bryant Park, having the kind of intimate whisper fight that's many-tentacled and mysteriously metaphorical, about each other, but also a wormhole, all of our past lives and their bad spells, zombie rising. I hung up the phone and sat and mangled a coffee cup in a shitty cafe on 6th Avenue, adrenaline, metal in my mouth. You still want to come over, she texted. You still want me to come over, she texted. Of course, I wrote back. I didn't know what to say that night when she showed up at my door, so I asked her if she'd trim my beard. It made a different kind of sense. Let's try this again. Here's my throat and a sharp thing. She sat on the counter and pulled my jaw to her, and I kept my eyes closed, letting myself go. I thought, what is life but this turn, this edge, this moment already slipping by, already gone? We need these edges, and we need to push through them. Without the boxing gloves, without the spangle of nerves lighting up when I hear a guy threaten his girlfriend, without the mirror me I see each morning, the startle of the stranger I've become, I not have the moments that fall into place on the other side. The hot breath, the fist connecting to the bag, the fraternity of the guy on the train platform, laughing with me about the weight of my luggage. The truth is, like you, I've got nothing but time. Like you, I'm nothing if not a house of cards and a shifting relationship to my own vulnerability. My body is expensive, violent, priceless. I paid in rough exchanges with meatheads and friends who fell quietly away, and blood tests and shots and shots and shots to wake up a shirtless pillow on this hot July morning on the Lower East Side. What changed was that I wanted more than anything to be alive, and this summer I see that I'm nothing less. To live is to expose your body to risk, like crosswalks and anesthesia, and a woman who sees through you and tells you so. It's train tracks and trust, and words like knives across telephone lines, and then those same mouths in real time, the jump cut of new beginnings alongside bodies like mine, jagged with scars and holding sharp things to each other's throats. All of it, every second of it, a tenderness, too. Thank you.
He's on already? Okay, all right. Thanks for that. The first thing I wanted to ask was, how did you come up to the Rumpus? Was it through Julie? What was the process of that?
No, if you all don't know the Rumpus, which hopefully everyone does, it's great.
Everyone knows the Rumpus.
Everyone knows the Rumpus that Stephen runs. That's really just a community, of writers. And I wanted to, so I moved to New England from San Francisco, and I started my transition that week. And that was a really intense thing to do. New England is really different from San Francisco, and I felt immediately kind of afloat. And so within that first month, I think, I was like, I just want to write about this for someone. And I think a niece, I talked to her because she was the film editor there at the time. And then Isaac just took the first pitch and said, yeah, I'd write a column. And that was it. Yeah.
And then Julie edited it.
Yeah, Julie edited it.
It's great. It's just such a beautiful column.
Thank you.
But the book is different.
It like predates it, I'd say. It's the story behind The Self-Made Man.
But you can see stylistically, you can see the link.
Yeah.
You know, would you say your style shifted around that point as a writer?
Like around the point in which I started the book, around the point
when you were when you were first transitioning, I guess.
Yeah, I think I had nothing to lose, like as a human being, and a lot about Self-Made Man is so important to me, and Rumpus is so, like, I feel very emotional about this conversation with Stephen because I feel like we haven't had a conversation about how important this has been to me, but I didn't see my story, I didn't see myself in the world, and so that column was a lot about how do I find myself as a person, and myself as a man, and myself as a trans man specifically, but just a man in the world, and I think anything I was holding back as a writer just sort of fell away immediately because it was the first column is about going to this truck stop bathroom and having to use the bathroom, being really afraid that somebody, which over time is dissipated, but are people going to realize, like, that I'm trans by the way I'm using the restroom? And, it was really early. I was in Maine, in the middle of nowhere, and I was really freaked out. And, like, so it's like I start with the bathroom, so really there was nowhere to go but down, deeper,
It's funny, I mean, you mentioned that, the idea of, like, being a trans man versus just being a man.
Yeah.
Because that seems like something, like in the book, the book is about being a man.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I don't know, when I first started, before I started reading it, I imagined it would be more about the transition, but I really feel like the focus is, like, you've got this question, and you're going to keep punching at it until you find an answer, It's very, somebody once told me that they knew, this is a mean thing to say, but they knew James Fry's memoir was a lie because it was linear.
Right.
And if you're writing something true and painful, you circle.
Yeah.
You never come straight at it. And so the book seems to be like you have this question in the middle of it and you're coming at it from every possible angle. And it's not, what is it about being a trans man? It's about what does it mean to be a man?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
I think so. And I think maybe a big part of what the Rumpus column was about, and then also what the book is about, is that highlighting that question is really important to, I think, most men. I haven't had a single conversation with a guy who's read this book who hasn't said, trans or not, who hasn't been like, this is the single most important thing that I think about every day. Because it's like, how do I be a different man? Usually from my dad. I mean, that's really, seems like a real universal.
How can I be different from my dad?
Yeah. So I think that's what we're all struggling with, And I think the nonlinear part is really crucial too, because I think that it's a very thematic book. And, I have a professor from grad school who used to say that art comes from the word artifice. And I think that there's something about that. Like, you can't really, memory doesn't work in a linear way, right? But you really can't recreate time. It's so silly to be linear with something as, important as your memory. Like, that's not how we experience memory at all. So, as much as possible, the truest things seem to be to circle around these ideas.
And what you're using here, I don't know how many people here have read the whole book, but you have these kind of two horrible examples of men, one is this person that mugged you that then went on not long after and killed somebody.
Yeah.
So went on a mugging spree, basically, mugged a bunch of people.
Shot somebody else
who lived.
Yeah.
And then killed somebody who worked at Google, was applying for a job at Google.
Yeah, applying for a job at Google.
And that was a big story at the time in San Francisco. So then you see, here's the guy that mugged me not long ago at gunpoint.
Yeah. And
you see him in the paper. So that's like your first, it's one of the two examples of men. Well, but that guy is probably, he's mentally ill, right? Isn't that the first?
Or addicted to something or something.
Something.
Yeah.
And yet, it's not really about that. It's about violence, and which we tie up so often with manhood.
Yeah.
And then the other, being your father.
Yeah. Who was abusive, right? So in reconciling, but it's also about how complicated life is, because in the book this mugging happens, which is really central to the book and my life. This mugging happens, and then I escape, and at the time I have not yet transitioned. Most of the book takes place prior to my transition, so I get away, and then I get away because I'm not male, and then he goes on to have an MO where he mugs couples and kills the men or shoots the men in the couples. So I think that for me it was just like, there's no, the point is I became embodied. There's no right way to be embodied, and I think like coming up against someone's like weird dark thing about, I guess he had a gender thing, which really I guess was what spoke to me. I was like, well, I guess we both have a gender thing. So, yeah. And so the book is about, can you be a different kind of man than the worst kind of men you see?
And it's a particularly poignant moment in the book where you're talking to, I guess it was your partner at the time?
Mm-hmm.
I never know the right term anymore. Partner, girlfriend.
Yeah, that was right.
I can't say anything, So your partner, and you said to her that this was the best thing that ever happened to you.
Right.
You want to talk about that a little bit? She was not fond of that description.
No, she felt really differently, but I think that, but I think that for me, so I had these two traumas in the book. The opening of the book, the first section of it, it goes back and forth between these two traumas. And so, to me, what was so important about this mugging that happened to me was that I was able to escape it, and escape it in my own body and on my own terms. And after that, like almost immediately after, I had a very visceral, primal relationship with the actual escaping. So I got really interested in like, why did the running away specifically feel so healing? And I didn't have a PTSD reaction or anything. I just felt really jubilant and alive. And I actually did a lot of research into like, why do prey animals not have PTSD? Because it seemed kind of similar. And it turns out that they don't, because all of the ways that like, our hormones work in our bodies, like they are designed to escape and then to rejoin the herd and then to be okay again. So I felt like I had this really interesting moment where I had like a dissonance in my body that had been growing, but I had this moment in my life where I was able to be so embodied, like more embodied than probably any of us will ever be again, except for like in death or something, you know? It was like the most embodied human experience I could have had. And even in that moment, I was like, something's wrong. And so that sent me off on this whole journey, but I wasn't mad at my body, which I think was the first time I realized that everything that was going on. So in that way, it was the best thing that happened to me, you know? It was an opportunity.
And I'm sorry, what was you named your partner in the book, but I've forgotten. Parker. And, but her experience was traumatic, and one of the things that seemed to be going on was she'd come face to face with fear and couldn't get past that, which is like a thing. Like that's like that PTSD can be like built around.
Right.
You know, like I don't know. As a kid, my father was beaten up by some guy after my father beat up his kid.
Right.
You know, they had it coming. I mean, it had to be coming. You know, but he never got over it. You know, he talked about it, but it was because it wasn't because he lost. It was because he was afraid. He couldn't, and it's very hard to get over that.
Right. Well, and like the ways our bodies react to being in trauma. Like I mean, trauma is just an overwhelm, right? So it's like, for me, I got to have this really intense anatomy of my relationship to being in a traumatic moment, and I sort of left my body for that whole moment. And and we all have different reactions physically, so her reaction was very different. But to me, it was an anatomy lesson, more than anything else.
This seems, but also, I mean, the book itself, it's so concerned with honesty. Like it really fulfills that idea of Philip Lopate had written about this, about honesty as a vertical dimension, that you can keep going deeper and deeper. Like honesty is a moving target, because you can only ever be as honest as your self-knowledge.
Yeah.
And by exploring yourself, you learn yourself more, you become more honest, but then you change and you have to follow it. So it's always this moving target, but you keep going there. And nothing, I think embracing fear and acknowledging it is about as honest a thing as you could ever do, which is part of what you're writing here.
Well, last night I was on this panel at SVA and somebody was like, whatever. I mean, they were like, when you looked in the mirror and you had this moment of seeing yourself. I didn't love this question, but they were like, when you saw yourself for the first time being yourself or whatever, you felt good about it. How did that feel? And I said, like, they were like, did it feel like everything came together and that was it? It was the truth? And I said, it felt like the truth in that moment. And everything came together for a second. And I think in all of our lives, like, the best thing that we can do is, like, integrate all of ourselves, how we are in the world, how we are in space, how we are in time, and all these different moments into one moment. And then it's fleeting, and then everything falls apart again. And you're like, well, that was that. Like, now something else is dissonant and needs to be integrated into who I am.
Yeah, well, it's like when you write, when I did my memoir, that for a good year afterwards, I was good with it.
Yeah.
But eventually, I started to move away from it. Well, I wasn't really that person in the book anymore.
Yeah, that seems right.
Right.
I mean, I think writing for the internet is helpful, actually, because these things sort of go out into the world. We always sort of forget in a way that makes me a little nervous that this is actually out there forever, but we put it all out into the world, and then it's, like, interesting to people for about 5 minutes, and then they forget about it, and maybe, like, 2 days if you're lucky or whatever. And but I learned to let go, and I think the book, I feel the same way, where I had to write it in such an intimate space. I actually, with everything else I write, I know people are reading it. I feel very aware of that. With this book, the only way I could write it was to think that nobody was going to read it, even though I knew. But even so, I feel like it's with all of you now, and it's not mine anymore. I don't feel like that's me anymore.
I wanna open up for questions in a little bit, because I know that we have a big crowd here actually, and which is great.
Yeah.
It shows that you're very popular. I'm really excited about the book. But first, I wanna ask a little bit about the other man that you really get into in the book, which is Roy, or your father. Mm-hmm. Talk about a little bit about that person. And he's a difficult guy, and he's, in a way, the guy that mugged you is like, what was his name? Hampson?
George. Yeah.
George. But
Huggins.
Was that?
Huggins.
Huggins. That's it.
Ironically, his last name.
Yeah.
Is, yeah.
And But there's different. He's a drug addict, or he might be crazy.
Yeah.
But your father is quite a sinister character, actually.
Yeah. He's sinister because he's complicated, right? Like all the best villains,
Right.
And
you didn't, especially growing up, you didn't hate him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In fact, you seem to be defending him quite a few times.
Yeah. And maybe you can relate to this, actually. I don't know.
I hated my father.
Did you? Yeah. I mean, I'm saying that to you because I've read a lot of his work, but you have very compassionate portrayals of your father in your books, which has been actually really inspiring to me. So, but you feel hate?
Well, no, I said when I was growing up, I hated my father.
Okay. But looking back.
But you did not seem to hate your father
No.
growing up. As a writer, you have to learn to look at things from the other person's point of view.
Yeah.
If you can't, it will not be interesting. It's almost like writing about somebody almost forces you to forgive them, because otherwise,
Seems true.
and to really forgive them, like because the reader will know if it's false,
Yeah.
But you have to be able to get inside and understand their truth and know what is true to them, even if it's false to you.
Yeah.
And so yeah, with my father, I had to do that. But growing up, I didn't like him at all.
But you must have been compelled to do it, or you wouldn't have wanted to write about it.
Yeah, but as a kid, man,
Yeah,
I was a very unforgiving kid. I was stern.
Yeah. But I think maybe for me, because I realized, it was complicated with my dad, and I wanted a dad, in retrospect, probably for a lot of reasons. And, I think that it was complicated, and a lot of this book is about taking back a story that was told to me and making it actually mine. I think my life growing up was very confusing. My narrative was sort of spoon-fed to me, and I really didn't understand how to engage with what was a really complicated situation. My dad was a bad guy in a lot of ways, but he also did do loving things, and so when you're a kid, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think I also felt really conflicted about why it didn't make sense. Was something wrong with me that I felt positively about him sometimes, and how could he be? I think it's a luxury to believe in just evil. I think people who believe in evil are usually people who've never experienced it. And so I think, with relation to my father, I really felt like I needed to reconcile something about the reality of him, and that's what a lot of the book's about, because that's a lot of my life has been about that.
Yeah, but as a kid, he was sexually abusive, which is one of those things where it's not so. A lot of times, abuse is kind of well, is it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sexual abuse is not that way. Sexual abuse is cut and dry.
No.
And so. I just remember that, you told the story to the police. You were 10 years old or something?
Yeah, 10, yeah.
And then the sheriff takes on this whole statement and then says, let me ask you something. Do you want your father to go to jail?
Right.
And you said no.
Right.
Right.
Because I knew I needed to, because my whole family was relying on him financially. And I think that's the kind of thing that, that's the real story of what happens in these situations. It's not always this thing where it's the justice wins out, or I knew justice didn't exist when I was 10 years old, because that wouldn't have been what I would have said if I believed that justice was a thing, or at least that there was a system of justice that existed that would work. So, and I think life from the very beginning to me seemed much more complicated than the sort of betrayal or the access to what options were out there, in terms of what. So when I would watch TV shows and when there were bad guys, I was that's just not how life works, and I already know it. I'm 10.
Well, it is interesting, when you look at these models, and yet still, you were a man.
Yeah.
And, I think it'd be hard for some people to understand that, that after seeing your relationship with men being this, and the way your mom said men,
right.
Which is, you repeat a couple times, and it's very, pretty devastating, and yet here you are, a man, and wrestling still with that question, I guess.
Yeah, although I think that it's possible to be a good man, which I didn't know before my transition, which is really an exciting piece of information,
You're a good man, honestly.
Thank you.
So I wanted to open this up to the audience, because I think there's some questions out there probably.
Maybe it's a question for stories.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Katie.
I loved your book. I read it in 5 minutes, and everybody who hasn't read it, read it immediately. It's wonderful. My question is, so you said that before you transitioned, you didn't know it was possible to be a good man. And I'm wondering if there's anybody, any characters that you thought about including, or ones that maybe impacted you in some way or inspired you to try to be that kind of man. Maybe you didn't know a good man well.
Yeah.
Like if you had role models.
Yeah, so my brother's in the book a little bit, and I think he's the guy that I respect a lot. My younger brother, mostly because we came from the same family, and he also really seemed to struggle with that. And I just didn't, I was really careful with my family. I didn't want them to be in the book a lot, just for their own privacy. I realized I'm really open in a way that most people aren't, and I tend to attract people in my life who are really private for some reason, and then I have to do this whole negotiation about that. So with my brother, I really kept him out for that reason. And then there is this character in the book, this guy named Mike, who was like a guy I was getting weightlifting tips from, and he's a real guy, and he's really exactly like he was in the book. But I think I met a lot of guys like that, where he was this very macho, but also very tender, nurturing figure. And so I wanted to. They were always sort of, they were like satellite men in my life. But I sort of got a hint that these people existed beyond me. But in retrospect, there are plenty of good men, of course, in the world. I just wasn't being exposed to them, and I wasn't allowing myself that exposure because of my own stuff. And then I think that transitioning helped me see a lot more of those types of men. Thank you.
Hey, Tom.
Hi.
I'm curious about, I don't know if I have this quite right, but I think you had been writing this book or a book like it before the mugging happened.
Yeah.
And before you knew for sure you were going to transition.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about the process of how the book evolved as all of these things were evolving in your ideas of being a man.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that.
So, and I'm curious, I'm going to put this question to Stephen too, actually, in a second, but I feel like I was writing one book for a really long time that wasn't this book at all, but feels like the exact same book. It was a novel about a guy who was a guy, so I was not yet a guy, but a guy who goes on a road trip, that really weirdly echoed this book in a lot of ways, and I was writing that in grad school, and then I was writing a series of essays, lyrical essays on monsters and ghosts that I think I was trying to write about the same material that became this book, but there wasn't a container for it. And then when I was mugged, that just became a flashpoint that I could center the whole book around. So I was writing a book for 3 years that feels like the same book, even though everything about it was different. But it was the same themes. And then when I got mugged and when I had a way to sort of gather the narrative around something, I felt like a lot of the things I was writing about before found their way into this book and got to settle in a way that felt right. But is that a normal thing?
That is a completely normal thing. I mean, it is. It's so common, that people write their first book, put it in a drawer. It's not quite there, there's something about it that's not quite as true as it needs to be, but it was all there. You made so much use of it, clearly. You had written it out, so it was ready for you, and when you really figured out, oh yeah, this is actually what I want to say.
Yeah.
This is actually what I want to talk about, and it was there waiting for you. So I think it's totally common,
Yeah.
It's normal writing process for sure.
Excellent. I feel very, very validated right now.
I mean, most people are gonna. I've twice worked on a book for a year, 2 separate years, and then one day just be like, yeah, it's not gonna work, and just, yeah.
And then it came together into one book.
No, those are just guys.
Well, for now, we'll see. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, nice meeting you. It's my first Strand thing. Where would you, hi, where would you be if that mugging experience didn't happen? Would you have found that kind of breakthrough, that transition, if that mugging didn't happen? Have you ever thought about that? What if this didn't happen? Would I be the man I am today?
Yeah. So last night I had I did this panel at SBA and it was great, but it was very strange. It was a design panel, and there was design entrepreneurs who were LGBT, and it was a bunch of designers and then me, and I didn't know why I was there, but it was fun and it was cool. And afterwards, and I was probably the only trans person that any of these people had ever met, which was fine. And then afterwards, a lot of people talked to me, which I was also into, but this one lady asked me this question, and she was like, this might be too personal, which I was like, probably it is, because you're saying it. But she was like, this might be too personal, but do you ever just wish you were born a guy? Do you think about that? And I was like, honestly, I find that like a futile exercise, because what's the point? Like, you know, because she said, well, you said in something you wrote that you wouldn't change a second of your life. So, is that true? Would you really, like, if you could be born male, if you could go back and, like, you know, I think until we invent time travel, or like until we figure out physics in a different way, maybe if we did, then it would be something I'd really want to think about deeply. But I just feel like I don't. For me, my like whole, I think, just spiritual base and way of being in the world is just to not even wonder, really, you know? Like, I think I'm really happy about every moment that's happened until this moment, because I'm really happy with this moment, you know? So I guess in that same way, I don't know the answer to that question, because it's like, I can't imagine a life where this hadn't happened to me, you know? And I wouldn't want a different life.
But did you know, one of the things you talk about that I've noticed that I hadn't heard before, you don't refer to yourself previously as male, you know what I mean? Like prior to the transition, where most people I know in your situation refer to themselves, oh, I was always a man. I was a man before, you know, my transition. The transition is just part of this thing, but I was a man.
Yeah.
But you never talk about it that way.
No, because I think I was who I was. Like, I mean, and I wasn't female either. I don't know. I was living in some way that was working for me until it wasn't anymore. And that idea of, like, you know, I didn't walk through the world going like, oh, all I wish right now was that I was a man. As soon as I started feeling that way, I was like, man, I think I'm a man, you know, and then that changed everything. So I knew that my gender was different, and I felt liminal or something, but I didn't feel specifically like, I felt masculine. I didn't conceive it. My story wasn't working like narratively in that way for me. So then it doesn't make sense for me now to go back and rewrite it so that it makes more sense for everyone else, you know? So just like, just living how I lived, you know?
Hey, Thomas.
Hi.
So I was going to ask you this question, and then I thought about how ridiculous it was, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Great.
So the question I was going to ask was, are you the man that you thought you would be, that you would become? And then I thought the question was ridiculous because I turned it back on myself, and I was like, am I the man that I thought I would become when I was, like, let's say, a teenager?
Right.
And I guess the thing is that those of us who are male, who are also born male, born biologically male, take so long to become the men that we become that we've probably forgotten by that stage what we thought. Whereas you've kind of gone through the process faster, so maybe you have something more insightful to say.
Right. So one thing that's great about this event is that I work in media, so there are a lot of reporters in the room, like Gideon. So I feel like I appreciate that question, because it's a very well thought out question. So I think, so that's one. Two, I think that I don't know, I don't do a thing, which has sometimes been the cause of frustration for people in my life. I don't envision a future that looks one way. And I don't have an answer if someone's like, well, what is going to happen in 6 months? Like, I just don't know. Like, I don't think like that. I do have an intuition, you know, and I you know, and not to get too like woo, because I know I'm in New York, not San Francisco, but I had this idea of myself. It was like a blurry, like my whole process before my transition was actually really kind of beautiful. It was so stressful. I was never sleeping. I was mugged, and then I knew something had to change. But I was having these like nights where I wasn't sleeping, but I didn't feel bad. I just felt kind of like, I don't know, like weird and electric, and I couldn't fall asleep at night. I'd have all these weird visions, and I at one point had this vision, it's in my book, of like this guy at this kitchen table, and it's like, he's like got dark black hair, and he's got kind of a beard, and he's sort of blurry, and he just is like not wearing a shirt, and he's like eating cereal, and it was so like clear. I was like, that's me, like I know that that's me. And that was like the moment where, I mean, not like an epiphany, but it was like a moment where I was like, I really think I'm a guy, like, you know, because I was really struggling. I mean, it's an intense prospect, you know, to be like, am I a completely different thing than I was born? So that was really important to me, and I think in that way, in so many ways, physically, I look exactly, I don't know how to explain it, it's so strange. Physically, I look exactly like I expected to look, even though I didn't know what I was looking for. But it's right, it's who I was. But every other way, I think, I didn't know how to design being a good guy, just like I don't know how to be a good person. I just feel like the more you like go through every day trying to be better and to integrate everything that's come before, that's the only way to do that, you know? So I knew I wanted to be kind, and I knew I didn't want, I guess the one thing I can say, maybe this is insightful, maybe it's not, like I really wanted to be intentional about being a man, I knew there were a lot of pressures. Like my brother like talked about this a lot. We had a really weird conversation when I told him I was gonna, I was like, I'm gonna go write this new name. I want you to use these male pronouns. He was very cool about it. We had a great conversation, and we had like kind of a weird moment where he was like, well, he was sort of trying to help me, I think, and he was like, like trying to like give me some advice about like if guys say weird things, just don't say anything unless it's like you want to make a point of it, and you might get into a fight, and like he was just trying to like help me, but I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna. That's not the way I'm gonna do that, And I really haven't like succumbed to sort of those sorts of masculine expectations that I just thought were bullshit, It's like if somebody is like being offensive, we were talking about like stuff about women especially, and I was like, fuck that, no. Like I'm gonna say what I want to say, and then maybe I'll have to get into a fight. Okay, like it's been fine, So that's one thing, is like being intentional about that stuff has been really. I guess I'm the kind of guy I want to be about that.
I do want to point out, just because it's so easy to overlook when we're like talking about these like real things, it's just the language of the book is beautiful. I mean, it's really written by a writer. Like I think like I'm reading this, I'm like, this person started as a poet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
clear. Like it's just like, the best books are always written by poets. It's beautiful, line by line and page by page. It wouldn't matter, I think, what the topic was.
Thank you. That's really kind. And I was a poet. Yeah.
Of course, you can see it.
Being a poet is it's so hard. I don't know how many people in here are poets, but transitioning from being a poet to being a prose writer was the biggest transition I've made. I think.
Because the poets care about the sentence, all the best. I mean, you look at Raymond Carver was a poet first,
Oh, is that true? I didn't know
and
that.
Nick Flynn's memoir is beautiful, but yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
The poets always write the best books,
Any other questions?
but it's slow, right, and hard.
It's really hard. It's
That's
hard to write a
cool.
narrative. I mean,
Writing's hard for a poet.
Yeah. True indeed.
Hi. So I've been reading Self-Made Man since I was, I think, in high school. Now I'm a junior in college.
Oh my God.
And I actually printed out the, I think it was number 14, when I came out to my dad as trans my freshman year. Because I knew that, like, I knew I couldn't write something myself because I was kind of a mess. I was a freshman in college. And I sort of just, like, slipped it into his, like, laptop case, like, the night before he went back home from Thanksgiving. And he, like, gave me this really weird phone call where he's just like, well, I don't like your name. And it was sort of weird because I picked a name that was, my birth name was Alexander, I changed it to Alexander, but anyway. And I write, and one of the things I've found now about a year and a half into being on hormones is that I just get so, I don't know, bored almost of talking about it. Like, and people, that's the one story people want me to keep telling. They always want the body, the physical. And so I was just wondering, when you're writing, do you ever get bored? Is there times you have to push past that expectation to write something? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so wait, tell me which one's number 14 before.
I think it's the one where you're talking about Frankenstein.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's a really lovely story. Thank you so much for telling me all that. That's so sweet. And so, yeah, and I think in my work I don't talk that much about being trans. I actually don't make that. I mean, I think it's part of my life, and it's like, it's mentioned with Self-Made Man in every column, just so that if you come to it and you have no idea what this column's about, like there's usually some mention. My editor asked me to just make some mention of like testosterone or giving a shot, something, so people like realize what's going on. But beyond that, like I think in these sorts of events, I actually find this really kind of great. People in this room there's trans people here, there's definitely people who aren't trans here, there's queer people, there's straight people, and I think like for me, why I wrote Self-Made and why I write Man Alive and why I ask these questions is because I think we all need to be having this conversation about masculinity and about gender broadly, and about being a person. And I think that people will ask sort of some specific stuff, but really we're all asking. I try to make it as universal as possible and turn it back on people, and even the way people are framing these questions, as you can see, it's like, well, I was thinking about my own masculinity, and that's why I'm asking you this question about your masculinity, and that tends to be how these conversations go. So for that reason, I think if somebody, if people were just asking questions about my body, I wouldn't be having this conversation, and that's just, I feel very lucky that I believe that we're way beyond that, and I expect people to be beyond that, and then they meet my expectations. So I guess, no, I'm not tired of it, because I'm not having a conversation that's redundant. I'm having a much bigger conversation about gender and being a person.
Any other questions out there this evening? All right.
So last one.
Make it good.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually about the writing, which I completely agree with you about its beauty. The details about the sexual abuse are scant, but as a result, the reader is, like, you're left reeling because you just imagine the worst, which, you know, it is. I just wondered if you could talk about writing that in a time when everything's kind of out there, and how you did that.
Yeah. So I'm really glad people noticed that, because people have asked me this a few times, and I think for me, and I don't know how anyone else feels, but like when I read stuff that's really viscerally physical about people's trauma, I get really numb, and I just can't connect to it anymore. It feels numbing. And what I wanted with this book was for people to be just with me, like all the way with me through every single thing, because my experience is already one where there's a tendency to other, and I just didn't want that. And I, as a human being, like way beyond my own background, like just, I really feel like there's a violence in othering people that is something I'm always fighting uphill against. So with the abuse stuff, it's like, I wanted people to have the emotional experience of what that felt like, and to be with me in that. And it didn't, I felt that if I was too detailed in the physicality of it, it would just, people would, they would like hinge their own, projections onto that, or their own, I read this in the news, or even their own experience in a way that maybe would make them really distant, and it would deactivate it somehow. And I didn't want that. I wanted it to feel as real as it could feel for people, but in a way that allowed them to empathize and didn't turn them off, and make them turn away from themselves and me in the book. So I wanted it to feel like a connection. Oh, thank you.
Well, wonderful. On behalf of the Strand, thank you so much, Thomas and Stephen, for joining us tonight.